Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix. I'm your host, my name is Nigel, and on the show today we are going to examine what I have identified to be a crisis in thinking, and I'm going to run through a few examples on issues where hopefully I can illustrate to you that there are some basic failures in people's logical processing, if you like, of information, in their thinking skills, in their deduction and inference. And I'm going to use the examples as a means to illustrate the sort of deeper crisis that we're facing, even sort of deeper, if you like, than the obvious crises on the surface. So I want to try and get really down to the root cause. So I was moved once by a quote by Jiddu Krishnamurti a few years ago, when he said, or he didn't say it a few years ago, but I heard the quote a few years ago, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." So when I interpret that sort of quote in relation to what's going on today on planet Earth, I would consider this profoundly sick society to more accurately be described as a society or a culture that's profoundly off the rails of reality. So those of you who are familiar with my work will already know that my main message is that there is a truth crisis. The concept of truth has been lost, forgotten, or subordinated. It's no longer important, and anything goes, basically. Any old narrative that suits political expediency will be promulgated in the mainstream media for certain. And this doesn't necessarily extend to personal lives, of course. Personal lives can still be led completely in reality, but it's the man-made institutions of our culture, the politics, the economics, and everything, all of these man-made institutions that are determining our behaviour, governments and things, which appear to be fully departed from the rails of reality. And hopefully this episode might shed some light on that. That's my purpose. So the first of these examples I wanted to illustrate is the fact that you can't prove a negative, and it's irrational to attempt to do so or expect somebody else to try and do so. You can't prove a negative. So this was brought to my attention recently by a friend who offered the quotation, "Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence." And this little phrase really needs to be unpacked a little bit to see the deeper significance of it, because it's one of those things that you can hear and sort of jump aboard without realizing that there's a great big hole in it. So the idea of evidence of absence, if something doesn't exist, for example, there can be no evidence associated with a non-existent thing. If it simply doesn't exist, it is nothing. There is no mark anywhere in reality that can have any relation to that thing. There's nothing that could be used as evidence to support its existence. It's a non-existent thing. So there can be no evidence to prove that something doesn't exist. So you cannot, and what that really means is another way of saying you can't prove a negative. So on one level, that phrase, it's true that if you have no evidence of the existence of a thing, that you don't actually have any proof that it doesn't exist. But the point is, you don't need any proof that something doesn't exist. All you need to do is wait for proof to be brought that something does exist. So this means that the burden of the proof lies with somebody making a claim. making the claim of the existence of a thing, or making the claim of a causal relationship or a observed principle. The person making the claim has to deliver the evidence, taken from reality, of course. Where else could you get it from? Of whatever it is they're trying to assert. And the big problem comes with negatives, such as, it's been often said, well, you can't prove that God doesn't exist, therefore he probably does. And this is a sort of a bastardization, inversion of logic. It's an attempt to invert logic, but it's just illogical. Proof, evidence, reason, logic, all pertain to things that exist. The non-existent is nothing. It's a zero, a blank. It doesn't have any mark on reality anywhere. So, for example, you can't prove that God doesn't exist. You can't prove that unicorns don't exist. You can't prove that Father Christmas doesn't exist. But for anybody that wishes to assert that any one of those exists, the burden of proof is upon them to bring forth something that we can consider before we take seriously the claim that this thing exists. So it's important not to confuse this with sort of proving people could confuse the idea of proving a negative as, well, I can prove I wasn't at the scene of the crime. I didn't commit that crime because I can show you I was elsewhere. Now this is offering positive. Again, it's not proving a negative, it's disproving a false claim with actual evidence. So it's important to think these things through, and ultimately the big takeaway, which I invite you to go away and consider, is that you cannot prove a negative. The concept of proof rests ultimately on the law of identity. A is A. Things are what they are. And thus the concept of proof can only pertain to that which exists. It's important for anybody claiming to prove anything to stand on the conviction, if you like, the basic premise of your argument is that existence exists, that A is A, which in other words means reality is an objective absolute. Because we have to remember, of course, that without reality being an objective absolute, unaffected by any consciousness, yours, mine, or a divine consciousness, without that basic prerequisite, the whole concept of truth is destroyed. There is no truth, of course. If there's no reality, well then what does truth mean? So it's important to bear that in mind. And the reason I cite this example is because I have regularly come up against this insight that the person I was talking with seems to not grasp, that you can't prove a negative. So that is my first example of, if you like, common errors in thinking, which, on a small personal level can be inconsequential, but when we spot them in a culture, endemic in a culture, as indeed it seems to be today, or certainly veering that way, it can be a very serious state of affairs. So the second point I want to make is the failure to think in fundamentals, the failure to really appreciate what the root of an issue is and go straight there in our quest for truth, rather than sort of messing around downstream of all the arguments. If you use the analogy of a tree, instead of sort of fiddling around with the leaves, we want to go right to the trunk. So really, thinking in fundamentals basically requires an awareness of cause and effect, an awareness of what is a primary and what is a result. For example, if we were looking at a pile of ash on the floor, you'd clearly appreciate that is a consequence. It's not a primary. The ash was caused by the combustion of something. And similarly, if we look at anything like a car or a house or a chair, we can appreciate that the cause of the car or the house or the chair was the person or persons involved in its production, in its manufacture. So in some respects, cause and effect can be easy to see. But it's interesting to note that in this context, in this global situation that we're in, where an alleged health threat is being used as justification to sort of shut down economies and countries and impose draconian rules, taking away people's freedom, when we are faced with such a big deal as that, such a massive issue with huge implications for the future of humanity, it's very, very important to get to the fundamentals. But I have found in my conversations with people, in interviews, in chatting with just ordinary people on the street, that very few people have, firstly, an appreciation of the importance of the fundamentals, also an awareness of indeed the whole concept of fundamentals. That is often absent. And if they have either of the two, most people seem to be quite dismissive of its need, that they don't really grasp that that's where to go to solve any problem. If you're solving an electrical problem or plumbing problem in your house, you really want to get to the nuts and bolts of the problem. You don't want to be mopping up water from a leaky plumbing system and just, as soon as you've mopped up the water, there we go, we've dealt with the problem. That would be silly. It's obvious that hasn't dealt with the problem. But it's also equally obvious that if you don't go to the fundamentals of an alleged particle or microbe that has a massive impact on humanity, you'd want to get to the fundamentals of that situation too. So another example of not appreciating fundamentals is most people go and see their doctor when they feel unwell, and they present a set of symptoms, and their doctor will match the set of symptoms with his knowledge of various conditions, ailments, diseases, and then he'll also match that ailment with a prescribed drug, usually, very often antibiotics. And the point is that neither the patient nor the doctor are mindful of a causative agent at the beginning of the sequence of events that has resulted in their feeling unwell, in their symptoms. And most people won't ask their doctor, what is the cause of my disease? They'll just assume that the doctor knows and is on the case, which is kind of an absence of thinking. And even the doctor, who is doing some thinking, is quickly jumping to conclusions, consulting his training and his references to work out what particular drug can be prescribed for this particular set of symptoms. And none of this is fundamental. And such failure to address fundamentals doesn't suit the individual patient at all. It's really their responsibility to think in terms of fundamentals. But this very much does suit, of course, the drug companies that are making the drugs that are being prescribed, because it simply won't cure. And this, again, should be fairly obvious. So it's important to realise that in this alleged situation, where an alleged health crisis is causing all of these reactions across the globe, it's very important to notice that that it all rests on two fundamental issues. And the first one is the existence of the alleged causative agent of this outbreak of illness. And the second is that the alleged causative agent be proven to actually be causative in producing the symptoms. Now, whether or not you take my word for it or not, I'd recommend that you don't take my word for anything, by the way, but it's a matter of fact. If you care to do due diligence and search for the evidence of these two causal factors, you'll find that they're absent, which is remarkable in and of itself. It usually takes people a while, presuming they can get their head around that in the face of course, the mainstream narrative, assuming it's all done and dusted. It couldn't possibly be lying and all that sort of stuff. And most people, it takes a while for the enormity of this fact to sink in, but I do challenge you to check out the work of Doctors Cowan and Kaufman and look into this. But the fundamental thing in the chain of events, the sequence of events, is the existence of the offending particle, and that has not been proven. And this illustrates a massive failure of our culture. And when you dig a little bit deeper and you find that the method that's practiced by virologists in isolating these alleged particles, when you look into that and you appreciate that logically they're not separating anything from anything else, and these are people in mainstream culture, mainstream health culture, who are spearheading humanity's drive to find these new remedies and vaccines and immune techniques to protect our health. These are the people at that forefront, and they are off the rails of reality. When you check out, and I seriously encourage you to do so, the standard virology techniques of isolating viruses done in a culture as per Enders, and the papers studied from the Enders experiment, I think originally in 1954. So I'd urge you to check that out. So again, this example illustrates not only amongst ordinary people who don't care to be too bothered with evidence of existence of things anymore, but it also shows us how profoundly off the rails of reality the sort of sharp end of medical research is, or the sharp end of mainstream medical research. Many of you may well be familiar with the fact that gut health, and until very recently, has enjoyed a huge surge of interest in the alternative health research community, and much has been learned, but all of the information that has been learned, funnily enough, contradicts the main theory of disease, which still predominates, which is contagion. So there's a lot to look into there in terms of fundamentality. The third example I want to present you with is one that surprised me when I first noticed that a lot of other people that I spoke with couldn't really appreciate what I was saying. They didn't really get my concern. And so the point is that secret societies, or my claim is, I should say, that secret societies are the perfect organizational structure to conceal evil and therefore to do evil. So I'm going to cite the example of Freemasonry, which I know a little bit about, not a lot. I'm not a Freemason. I've spoken to people who are, and I've spoken or listened to what the Freemasons put about themselves, and I've read and looked at the writings of Manly P. Hall, Albert Pike, Madame Blavatsky, etc., to get a flavour of what's going on underneath this secret society. And what I've learned is that there are three main features of Freemasonry, of this particular fraternity, as they call it. And what amazes me is that people I speak to don't grasp the significance of these particular characteristics. So in terms of a failure of thinking, you could say it's a failure to spot implications in some shape or form, which is rife. And the first of these characteristics is that Freemasonry has a sort of a Russian doll structure, if you like, of fraternities within fraternities, or circles within circles. And in principle, there is a degree of secrecy. As you ascend up or ascend into the inner sanctum, if you like, of these concentric circles, you're not necessarily privy to the discussions that go on in those higher or more internal groups. You're told what you're told on the outside, and there's a general culture of secrecy, and this is not denied. Those lower down in this particular structure will have no direct knowledge of what goes on at the higher levels as you go up to, I think there's 33 degrees of Freemasonry, and as you were to get towards the 33rd degree, or in any way, shape or form get higher up the hierarchy, you progressively find out more as you go, and you very specifically on the inner landing sort of circles, if you like, at the outside of the structure, you know very little. And of course most candidates, if you like, most initiates are blissfully ignorant and really don't care what it's all about. They're probably more mindful of joining an old boys network to perhaps get ahead and further their business interests, etc., etc. So this is the general perception and a lack of appreciation for the significance of the secrecy. Also, in order to proceed into this inner sanctum or up the hierarchy towards the 33rd degree, you have to be invited by existing members, which essentially is a mechanism for vetting particular candidates and only allowing in suitable candidates within the structure of the organisation. Now, the last point I wanted to bear in mind here is that there is also the swearing of an oath of allegiance. So you've got these 3 points. You've got the fact that it's a secret-based structure with a hierarchical structure. You've got secrecy, and you also have an oath of allegiance, which, even according to the Masonic writings themselves, reveal that can be really quite gruesome if you are to betray your oath. So we can see there that there's a mechanism designed to conceal. And when I've spoken to people who have become Freemasons and discussed these characteristics, I have been alarmed, if you like, surprised at the very least, to observe a lack of concern at these implications, and indeed a lack of awareness of them. I know people that have sworn oaths of allegiance that can't even remember what they said, or didn't really give it any significance. So what? It's just so. This really underlines my point, is that what I observe in my culture is this widespread lack of appreciation of implications, of extrapolating the present, thinking in principles and seeing where that might lead. What could happen as a result of this? That I perceive as another significant failure, obvious failure with tragic manifestation in our current Western culture. The other very significant implication of Freemasonry, and it's yet another point, but a part of the initiation ritual, or one of the initiation requirements, is that initiates concede to the belief in a higher power, a grand architect of the universe, as they call it in Freemasonry, or you could call it God or a supreme being. They don't really mind what you call it, but you have to acknowledge that the existence of a supreme being. Now, again, this has massive implications, because remember, this is at the front door of the whole fraternity. So it ensures that everyone who passes in has submitted to the concept of there being something higher than self. So they've necessarily, by implication, placed themselves down here and are looking up to a grand architect, supreme being, God, omnipotent power. And the point is that given such an implication and such a relinquishing of one's personal authority, you have implicitly destroyed any idea that your own sovereign consciousness can be your own highest authority. Now, as a rational egoist myself, I assume and hold that my highest authority is my own rational judgment of my own sovereign consciousness. There is no higher authority that can tell me what to do. As it happens that my rational ultimate highest authority necessarily advises me well that, for example, the non-aggression principle is no way to further my goals. So as a rational being, effectively, I don't need to be contained already. But it is interesting my main point here is that to anyone who accepts the existence of a supreme being is necessarily subordinating themselves to that supreme being. And I think that's a very significant thing for initiates into a secret society. It ensures that they're all yes men or doers or worker ants or worker bees, and there's not going to be any challenge to the authority, because in principle you've agreed to subordinate yourself to this unknown higher power. And I mean, furthermore, it's suspicious, I would say, to even not know what that higher power is, but that's yet another thing. We'll leave that one aside for today. So you can see that this lack of ability to spot implications strikes me as a common failing in human thinking. The fourth example I want to share with you is based on the concept of racism. So let's explore what racism is. Racism is widely agreed to be discrimination according to race. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. How do we distinguish one race from the other? And I would suggest the answer to that is by genetics. Okay, it is not cultural differences, it is not cultural preferences or habits that could be tied to geographic location and other factors. It's in the genes. When a Chinese person, for example, has a child with a Caucasian, and we say you get a mixed race child with characteristics that are a sort of a merging of the both parents, the reason is the genetic combination of both parents' chromosomes from their genes. Similarly, in a black person and a Caucasian, and you get this sort of mixed race. It used to be called half caste, but you're not allowed to say that anymore. I hastily add that my best friend is half caste, so I'm pouring no scorn on anybody. I'm not remotely racist. So you get this idea that it's in the genes. That's what produces the mixture, the result. So race is defined by genetics, and this fact you'll find carefully expunged from most dictionaries. It's very difficult to find, but if you think about it and don't place too much weight on dictionaries, definitions which are, you know, easily changed and modified over time, as I've covered elsewhere before, then you can see that it's genetics that swings, or race rather, depends on genetics. So the upshot of all this is that most people, again, I know that's quite a vague generalization, but the vast majority of people don't seem to appreciate that the fact of one genetic line assuming superiority over others is racism. That's discrimination. One race discriminating upon the basics of genetics. And so look into that a little more deeply, and any race consists of a number of families. It is families that bear the genetic lineage, as we know. So when we simply apply this, I would suggest that one genetic line, if you like, kept pure and unmixed over a long period of time, or selectively mixed, should we say, claiming to rule over others, is racism. And therefore, the English royal family is a perfect example of racism. But again, this conclusion that the royal family are the embodiment of racism, in a context when we have, you know, Black Lives Matter chuntering away to us, telling us we should value black lives and all races, this is rather insane. But again, it's a yawningly obvious deduction, inference, that most people just don't get. And the reasons of those for that not getting, you know, obviously a lot of the time most people don't even want to think of it. They just want to cling to their traditions, my mother being a perfect example. So there are a variety of reasons why people don't want to grasp this, but again, the point is that these dots are not joined, and that it is a cultural systemic failure in our thinking. My last example is the idea of taxation and the fact that any tax on a corporation is ultimately paid by the people, and this is something that we don't see. And I was prompted to include this example in this podcast because very recently on the BBC Propaganda they were telling me that the forthcoming G7 summit, which is to take place I think this Friday, this episode being filmed on Tuesday, so the G7 meeting is going to address the issue of sorting out a global tax, a global corporation tax, a once and for all measure to make it nice and fair and square, to make sure effectively that all those pesky corporations pay their fair share. So this is on the BBC News, of course, the BBC Propaganda, and everybody gives it a hearty hurrah, all those robot radical left people, and they think this is a strike is being made for championing the underdog and nailing those exploitative corporations. But let's unpack this idea and see whether this is really what's going on. So the basic point that you don't need to be a businessman to appreciate is that any business or corporation sets about to manufacture a product or produce a service. And the idea is that they incur costs and they charge a price for their product or service which more than compensates them for the cost, and they therefore make some profit and therefore justify the whole existence of the enterprise and the effort of the people involved. So clearly, if your prices that you charge are not slightly higher than your costs, you're going to go down the pan pretty quickly. And the idea is that you must be receiving revenue from your pricing that will more than outweigh the level of your costs. So all of the business costs need to be covered, every single one. They all need to be factored in. You wouldn't want to miss one out, otherwise you won't get your pricing correct. So what people fail to appreciate, I think, is that a taxation on a corporation is simply another operating cost. If at the end of the day the corporation makes a certain amount of profit and it's taxed and that profit disappears, but it actually wants to make that profit, all it would do, or it would have to do, is simply increase its costs, which would inevitably be passed on to you and I. Ultimately, either we're the direct consumer or we're the indirect consumer if that corporation is selling its product or services to governments or other institutions. Ultimately, it'll come down to the people to pay for it. And this is often not appreciated by most people. Furthermore, various shenanigans and procedures can be adopted to actually ensure that a corporation doesn't make any profit on paper. Of course, that's just a paperwork exercise that accountants are very proficient at. So the point is that calling for a taxation on Amazon or on any of these other nasty big corporations, as they're called, is really counterproductive, because all you're going to do is you're going to increase the costs on the products and services that you and I and governments and other institutions, that everybody ultimately, people pay the price. And this is very, very seldom appreciated. So in conclusion, we can see that there are common failures in human thinking, and a part of my whole gig here at lawfulrebel.com, my whole thesis, if you like, is that our crisis of truth is due to our crisis in the method of discerning truth, which of course is thinking. And we need to be aware that thinking and the exercising of our rational faculty is our survival mechanism. If you're a human being, your means of survival is using your rational faculty to its fullest, most efficient capability. Only then are you able to identify the facts of reality. Our human thinking is fallible, we can make mistakes, so we need peer review processes, we need to bounce ideas off others, we need to check our own thinking, we need to test our thinking against reality. If you're trying to make a dish, you're knocking up a recipe, if you get it wrong and it tastes disgusting and none of your guests enjoy it, you need to practice and identify the facts of reality that will stack up to produce that tasty meal. So it's reality that we need to know, and it's thinking skills that we need to employ to achieve that result. So when I bear in mind these ideas and how much difficulty many people seem to have in seeing the logic through the issue and arriving at a correct conclusion the other side, or spotting implications or observing fundamentals, it's because culturally wide we lack these skills. It isn't just somebody and somebody else, it's almost everybody. And don't get me wrong, I didn't have these skills either until I actually took the trouble to find out what they are. I have been engaged in a process of sort of reverse engineering my own thinking, and also reading what others write about thinking and philosophical underpinnings of thinking. And it's only this process of study that has revealed this to me. So I'm not coming from any position of I told you so or I know better. I'm uncovering these things. And I suppose my point here is that in recognizing these very significant weaknesses in our cognitive capacity and human thinking ability, this is a major red flag for our well-being as we try to stave off tyranny in our immediate and our medium and our long-term future here on Earth as human beings. Now, we're in a crisis of freedom at the moment, and we need all the thinking skills we can muster to figure out what is going on planet Earth. And it's not easy. But my implicit conclusion is that I don't hold out a great deal of optimism in the short or medium term due to the almost total absence of these thinking skills in the population at large. So I hope this helps you. I hope that maybe discussing some of these thinking skills around these issues might prompt you to look into the issues, and feel free to come back to me with any counter arguments. If there are mistakes I've made, I'm all ears to revisit my rational process and check that I haven't made an error. But I hope that in contemplating these ideas, maybe this has in some way helped your thinking process as well. As always, I invite you to visit the website lawfulrebel.com. There's stacks more on there about truth, how to discern it, and various issues that we need to be aware of. For example, what is freedom, what are rights, what is truth. All of these kinds of things are important issues for truth seekers to be grappling with at the moment. So thank you very much for listening, and I do hope you'll tune in for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be